I never thought a simple grocery delivery would change the rhythm of my life. I went there expecting to drop off bags of vegetables, snacks, and cat food, but instead, I walked into a quiet home filled with a kind of loneliness I hadn't felt in years. By the time the night ended, I wasn't just someone who rang her doorbell. I was the man she whispered to, asking if I could stay until morning. And that question, it wasn't about fear or danger. It was about something deeper, something human, something raw. What followed wasn't a love story in the way most people would imagine, but it was something far more real. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you. Make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. It started with a job I picked up off an app. I'd recently left a steady position working warehouse inventory. I'd been picking up part-time work while figuring out my next move. Grocery delivery wasn't glamorous, but it paid enough to cover the bills and kept me moving, which helped me think. That afternoon, the order came through with a special note. Please knock, I have limited mobility. The address was tucked in the older part of town, where houses had a little more charm and a lot more silence. I remember pulling up to her home. It was a small yellow bungalow, with paint peeling on the edges of the windows, and a wind chime dancing quietly in the porch light breeze. Something about it felt paused, like a place caught in time, waiting for something or someone. Her name was Ellen. She opened the door slowly, leaning a bit on the frame, as if it had become a part of her balance. She looked to be in her early 50s, maybe a few years older, with silver strands woven into her soft brown hair and a face that wore the weight of stories untold. Her eyes met mine briefly, and then flicked toward the bags I was holding. Offered a smile and stepped forward, unsure if I was supposed to hand them over or set them down somewhere inside. She gestured wordlessly to the kitchen and stepped aside to let me in. It wasn't the first time I'd been invited past the door. But there was something unspoken in the air. The kind of silence that wasn't awkward, just heavy. Inside her house was dim, but warm curtains drawn, small lamps lighting corners instead of the ceiling. Gosh. A record player sat in the living room, with no records near it, and a thin layer of dust softened everything like a film. As I set the bags on the counter, I noticed the fridge had a magnet from a zoo halfway across the country. My daughter sent me that, she said softly from behind me. I hadn't asked. She had a way of filling the air that told me she was used. It's being quiet most of the day, and wasn't sure if she should speak or let it pass. I nodded, not sure what to say yet, and began pulling out the items from the bags. Some people like their groceries left bagged, others want them sorted. She didn't say, but she watched me with a kind of gratitude that made me slow down. I didn't want to leave things out of place. As I handed her a receipt, her fingers brushed mine briefly. Cold, thin, but steady. She asked my name, and when I told her, she repeated it twice, as if testing it in her mouth. Caleb, she said again. It's a good name. I smiled and made a small comment about the weather, just to bridge the moment. And she laughed softly, as if remembering how to laugh in someone's company. Do you ever stay for coffee? She asked. I hesitated. It wasn't normal. I had other deliveries waiting. But something about her tone wasn't flirtatious. It was like an echo of hospitality from a life that used to be fuller. I checked the app and saw I had a gap before the next job. Shrugged and said sure, just for a few minutes. We sat at a small wooden table with mismatched chairs. She brewed coffee in an old percolator that whistled like it belonged to a different decade. The first few sips were quiet. She asked about my work, and I gave her the safe version. She didn't pry. She told me her knees made it hard to go out much anymore. I didn't ask why she lived alone, but her eyes flicked to a photo on the wall. Younger woman, maybe late 20s, in a graduation cap? My daughter lives 3 states away. She checks in when she can, she said, sipping her cup like she wasn't thinking too hard about it. The minutes turned to half an hour. I didn't realize how long I'd been there until my phone buzzed with another order. I stood and thanked her, feeling an odd pull as I stepped toward the door. She smiled genuinely and said, "You're kind, Caleb. Not everyone would have." Stayed? I nodded, unsure why her words felt more important than they should have. As I stepped outside, she added, "Be careful tonight. The skies got that heavy look. Over the next few days, I kept thinking about Ellen. It wasn't romantic, at least not yet. It was more like a voice you couldn't forget. I found myself hoping I'd get another order from her, but none came. Eventually, I gave in and searched for her name in the app's past deliveries, wondering if maybe I could request her address again, but it didn't work like that. Still, fate has a strange way of looping back. A week later, I got another order with a familiar note. Please knock. Limited mobility. And there was her name. When I showed up that evening, she answered with the same slow care. But this time, she smiled before I even said hello. You came back, she said. It's almost like a child who'd just been told her favorite book had more pages she hadn't read yet. I stepped inside again. And without even realizing it, something in me softened. Like I was slipping into a quieter, slower rhythm I didn't know I needed. The second time I stepped into Ellen's house, it felt less like I was delivering groceries and more like I was returning to a place that remembered me. I didn't realize how much that meant until I saw her face light up before I even reached the threshold. She wasn't wearing makeup. Her hair was pulled back loosely, and her sweater hung a little off her shoulder like she'd gotten dressed in the middle of something and never bothered to fix it. But there was warmth in her welcome, something unspoken that passed between us. Like the quiet recognition of two people who don't quite fit the world outside but manage to find peace in a shared moment. I stepped past the threshold and again found myself in that amberlit cocoon of a house with its dusty corners and lived-in charm. The air held the faint scent of ground cinnamon and something floral, maybe an old candle. Long burned out but still holding memory in the air, she told me to place the groceries on the same kitchen counter as before. And as I did, she was all ready. Reaching into a drawer for the coffee, I hadn't even sat yet. It was as though we both understood that the space between us no longer required permission. I moved through the kitchen like I'd been there a dozen times. We didn't talk much at first. She hummed softly as she spooned coffee grounds into the percolator, and I stood by the window watching the sun ease itself down behind the narrow trees that framed her backyard. It was the kind of sunset that made you forget for a second that the world was hard, fast, and often too loud. In that moment, everything was soft and slow. Her house seemed untouched by time, like it had built a nest around her and waited patiently for someone to come along and disturb the dust. I didn't want to disturb it, but I did want to understand it. And maybe, if I was honest with myself, I wanted to understand her. She poured the coffee into the same chipped ceramic mugs we'd used last time and set them on the table. Then she surprised me by saying she'd made banana bread earlier. Was cooling on a wire rack beneath a dish towel. When she lifted the cloth, the smell bloomed into the room like a wave of childhood nostalgia. It wasn't just good. It was memory good, the kind of smell that belonged in a house with kids running down the hall and someone laughing from the other room. But her house was quiet. Still, her fingers trembled slightly as she sliced the bread. Not from age, but from something deeper in energy that had nowhere to go. She placed a slice on a small plate and pushed it toward me with a shy smile. Like it was a gift she wasn't sure I'd accept. I thanked her, sat, and took a bite. It was perfect. It told her so, and she laughed again, the sound more familiar now, less guarded. She told me she used to bake with her daughter when she was small. That little girl could never wait for the bread to cool, she said, eyes shining a little too brightly. I didn't say anything. I just nodded and kept chewing. Sometimes silence is the best kind of company. She started talking about small things. Then, a book she'd started and never finished. The neighbors who used to stop by before everyone got too busy or moved away, a friend who now only texted on holidays. I listened not just with my ears, but with everything. There was something about the way she spoke that made me want to absorb it all. It's like storing up warmth before winter. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot. To us. Now back to the story. It was nearly dark by the time I looked at my phone again. I'd skipped the next order without even realizing it. I didn't apologize to her, and she didn't ask why I was still there. We both knew it wasn't. About the groceries anymore? I offered to take the trash out before leaving, and she gave me a soft thank you that clung to my back as I walked down her porch steps. The sky was a deep violet now, the kind that only showed up in early spring before summer turned everything gold. I took my time walking to the curb. When I came back, she was standing at the door, holding it open just a little. "Next time," she said, barely loud enough for me to hear, "I'll make tea. Or maybe we'll bake something together," I told her. That sounded nice, and I meant it. That night, I didn't take any more orders. I went home, turned off the app, and sat in silence, the taste of banana bread still faint on my tongue. Something inside me had shifted, and I couldn't name it yet. The next few days blurred by in errands and other deliveries, but none of them felt right. Everyone else was in a rush handing me money through screen doors, barely making eye contact. Already distracted by whatever screen or sound was pulling them away. But Ellen noticed things. She paid attention. And that made me want to return to her space again. Not for coffee, not for comfort, for connection. It was 5 days before I saw another order from her. This one came in the morning, a small list of essentials: milk, bread, canned soup, a few fruits. The note was the same: "Please knock. Limited mobility." But there was a new addition: "Glad it's you again, if it is." That made me smile in a way I hadn't in a while. When I arrived, she had music playing low in the background. Jazz, something mellow and classic. She met me at the door with the same worn sweater, but a brighter look in her eyes. I wondered how long she'd been waiting. If she had checked the app the same way I had, hoping the delivery would bring a familiar face. This time, after the groceries were unpacked and the mugs filled, she asked if I could help move a small table from one room to another. I said yes without hesitation. The table wasn't heavy, just awkward in shape. But the way she watched me lift it, you'd think I was moving mountains. She led me to a sunroom I hadn't seen before, windows on 3 sides, pale light flooding in, and a small potted tree that looked like it hadn't been watered in weeks. "Used to sit here with my husband," she said quietly, almost like she hadn't meant to say it out loud. I looked at her and saw the way her shoulders slumped, just slightly, the way her fingers twisted into each other. Before he got sick, before everything. I didn't ask questions, just adjusted the table near the window, angled toward the light. She nodded approvingly, and for a moment it felt like she was standing beside someone else, not me, not now, but someone remembered. When we sat again, she told me she hadn't had anyone in that room since he passed. "It's been 3 years," she said, "but today felt okay." She looked at me then, and her gaze didn't waver. "You make this house feel less hollow." I didn't know what to say. I just held her eyes for a moment and offered the only truth I had. "You make me feel welcome in a way I didn't know I needed." That was the first time I realized this wasn't just about loneliness anymore. Something was unfolding between us slowly, carefully, and with a quiet grace that didn't need to be named. It just needed to be felt. The sunroom became our place after that. It wasn't something we talked about or planned, it just became understood. Each time I delivered groceries to Ellen, she would ask, almost in passing, if I could stay for a little while. Sometimes it was for coffee, sometimes tea, sometimes just to sit quietly and let the late morning light stretch across the hardwood floor while the old jazz records played low in the background. I never said no. The rhythm of my days began to bend around those visits, rearranging themselves without protest. What used to feel like temporary gig work had transformed into something with purpose, even if that purpose didn't have a name. The app notifications came and went, but I found myself ignoring them more often than not. Deliveries could wait. Ellen never asked for much alone for presents, and I gave it gladly, not because I felt sorry for her, but because being around her brought a calm I hadn't felt in years. There was a day, about 2 weeks into this new rhythm, when the air outside had turned thick with rain. The kind of weather that fogged up the corners of windows and painted everything in gray. I had an umbrella, but when I knocked and she opened the door, Ellen was already standing there with a towel in her hand, ready to catch the drops as they slid from my sleeves. She ushered me in before I could even speak, scolding the storm like it was an unruly neighbor who'd overstayed its welcome. That day, the house smelled of rosemary and roasted vegetables. something simmering in the kitchen that made my stomach tighten with hunger. She told me she'd tried a new recipe and had made too much. I sat at the kitchen table while she served me a bowl, not even bothering to protest. As I ate, she talked about her garden, how the rain would be good for the lilies she had planted years ago. Most of them had stopped blooming recently, but she still watered them out of habit, hopeful that maybe one spring they'd surprise her. I could see the metaphor resting in the corner of her words, how she tended to things, not for what they gave, but for what they once meant. Helen was like that with people too, I think. She didn't ask for explanations or demand promises. She simply nurtured what was in front of her, with quiet hope and steady hands. As the storm drummed harder against the roof, she reached for a small notebook sitting on the counter and opened it with care. Inside were handwritten recipes, notes in the margins, smudges of flour and sauce like fingerprints from the past. She showed me a page her daughter had written when she was 10, complete with little drawings of stars and a smiling stick figure. She used to say cooking was magic, Ellen whispered, tracing the ink with her finger. Said it turned sad days into something warm. I didn't say anything. I just listened, letting the moment settle into the space between us. That afternoon, she asked if I wanted to see the garden. We stepped out the back door under a wide awning that shielded us from the rain. The garden was small, but tender pots lined along the edge of a low fence, each with its own memory. She pointed to each one, telling me what had grown there over, the years who had planted it, or what story it held. There was a patch of earth where her husband had once tried to grow tomatoes. He never quite took, she said with a smile, but he kept trying every year. Her voice carried both pride and melancholy. And I could see the way she carried those memories like fragile glass never too tight. Never forgotten, we lingered there until the rain softened, offered to help her cover the pots with tarp, and she handed me the supplies without asking why I would. It was always like that with his wordless understandings that needed no explanation. As I knelt beside the pots, tying the edges down, I heard her say my name. I looked up, and she was watching me with an expression I hadn't seen before. It wasn't gratitude or politeness. It was something closer to vulnerability, like she had opened a part of herself she wasn't used to sharing. It's been a long time since someone cared about this place, she said quietly. Or about me, for that matter. I stood and took a slow breath, unsure what to say. But then she smiled, brushing the moment away like mist on glass. Come back tomorrow, if you can. There's an old movie I'd like to rewatch, but not alone. I nodded, and that night I stayed up thinking about her. Not in the way I'd thought about women before. It wasn't about desire or longing. It was about presence, about being seen and seeing someone back. There was something about Ellen that peeled away layers of noise in the world. When I was with her, I didn't need to impress or explain, just needed to show up. The next day I came back without waiting for a new delivery order. I brought a pie from a local bakery and a bouquet of grocery store flowers that I didn't know how to pick properly. She accepted both with the kind of grace that made me feel like I'd brought her something rare. We watched the movie in the sunroom with the lights dimmed and a throw blanket over our legs, even though it wasn't cold. Halfway through the film, she leaned her head on my shoulder, and I let her. My arm moved behind her naturally, and she didn't flinch. Her breathing slowed, steady and rhythmic, and I sat there like that, not moving. Afraid to break the spell, by the time the credits rolled, she was dozing lightly. I shifted, careful not to wake her, and she stirred just enough. To whisper, "Stay a little longer?" I nodded, even though she wasn't looking. I stayed until the stars replaced the gray, until the shadows on the walls grew long, and the silence became less of a gap and more of a bond. I left only when her hand slipped from mine, warm and unafraid. After that, our visits grew longer. She told me stories I think she hadn't told in years about her first love. Her husband's quirks, the road trip she once took alone after turning 40 just to feel something wild again. I told her about my childhood, about the job I hated before delivery work, about the time I nearly moved across the country but couldn't go through with it. There was no judgment between us. It's only exchange. It's only human weight, balanced gently. Between two people who no longer needed to fill silence with sound. It was around this time, maybe the 4th or 5th week into our visits, that she started walking with a little more steadiness, moving around the house without her cane some days. She said it was coincidence, that the weather had been kind to her joints, but I suspected something else. I suspected that it wasn't the weather at all. Sometimes when people feel seen, they stand taller without realizing it. There's something about familiarity that sneaks up on you. It starts slowly, like a thread being pulled through fabric unnoticed until you step back and realize the pattern has changed. That's how it was with Ellen and me. What began as brief visits wrapped around grocery deliveries had slowly become the quiet heartbeat of my days. I would wake up thinking about whether she needed anything, not just in the practical sense, but in the emotional one. I'd find myself at the grocery store picking up things I thought she might like, even when she hadn't ordered them. Little things: a jar of jam I saw her once, a new kind of tea, an old movie DVD from a bargain bin. It wasn't obligation, it was care. And maybe that's what scared me, because I hadn't felt that kind of pull towards someone in a long time. That morning, I arrived without any delivery notification. I had already told her I'd drop by with a new tea I'd found, lavender and mintanned, she had said. I'll have the kettle ready. But when I knocked, there was no answer. At first, I thought maybe she was resting or didn't hear. I knocked again, gently, and waited. Still nothing. I reached for my phone to call the number she'd once scribbled on a slip of paper, just in case, and the door creaked open before I could dial. She stood there in a robe, her hair a little messier than usual, and her face a shade paler than normal. She smiled faintly and stepped aside, saying only, "I overslept. Didn't expect to." I asked if she was okay, and she nodded too quickly. Brushing it off like someone who didn't want to burden you with details, inside the house felt colder than usual, not in temperature but in tone. The lamps were off and the air felt heavier, like something had shifted overnight. I followed her into the kitchen, and she moved slower than usual, her hand on the back of a chair for support. She waved me toward the table, then set about boiling water. But I could see it, her movements were deliberate, strained, like she was hiding pain beneath layers of practiced grace. I didn't push. I just sat, letting the silence settle until she was ready to fill it. She eventually spoke, her voice softer than I'd heard it before. "Some mornings are harder than others," she said, as if admitting it might make it worse. "It comes and goes." I nodded. I'd seen my own mother have mornings like that, days when her body became a stranger, and even getting out of bed felt like a quiet war. We sat, sipping the new tea in silence. Then she asked if I'd mind helping her bring down a box from the attic. I told her, of course, and she led me to a small staircase I hadn't noticed before. The attic was cramped, filled with boxes labeled in fading ink, some pushed into corners, with cobwebs dancing around their edges. She pointed to one in particular, winter stuff, and I brought it down carefully. Back in the living room, she opened it with a sense of reverence, pulling out scarves, candles, and an old wool blanket with frayed edges. "These belong to him," she said, not needing to say the name. I understood. She held one scarf for a long moment before setting it aside. "I thought maybe we could light a few candles tonight. It gets dark so early now." The way she said we made my chest ache in a way I wasn't prepared for. There was no assumption, no pressure, just hope. We spent the afternoon arranging candles along the windowsill and dusting off small ceramic figures that had once decorated the fireplace mantel. She told me about Winter's past, how her husband used to insist on real trees, and how their daughter would beg to open presents days early. The stories spilled out more easily now, like water finding familiar grooves. As she talked, I found myself picturing those memories as if I'd been there: her daughter's laughter, her husband's deep voice teasing them both, the smell of pine and cinnamon. It was strange how real it all felt, as if by sharing them she had made room for me inside the history of that house. Later that evening, she sat wrapped in that wool blanket, her legs tucked beneath her on the couch. I made us both a bowl of soup from a recipe she guided me through, and we ate in the glow of candlelight. It was the kind of night that felt suspended in time, like a page in a book. You don't want to turn yet. After we finished, She looked at me with a tiredness that wasn't about sleep but something deeper. "Caleb," she said, barely above a whisper. "Can you stay until morning?" The words didn't hang awkwardly between us. They settled, soft and vulnerable, like a hand being gently extended. I nodded without hesitation, not because I thought. It meant something romantic, not because I felt obligated, but because leaving her that night felt wrong in a way I couldn't articulate. She wasn't asking for rescue. She was asking for presence. For someone to sit beside her as the night wrapped around the house, an old ghost stirred in the quiet. I helped her turn down the bed in the guest room, and she gave me a folded t-shirt from a drawer. "It used to be his," she said simply, placing it in my hands. I changed, brushed my teeth with a spare toothbrush she found beneath the sink, and lay on the bed, listening to the soft sounds of the house settling. Around midnight, I heard her footsteps in the hallway. She paused outside the door for a moment, then continued on. I didn't get up. I just let the rhythm of her presence reassure me that she was okay. The morning came slowly, with pale blue light filtering through the curtains. I made coffee before she woke and sat in the sunroom, watching the mist rise from the garden. When she entered, wrapped in a cardigan and smiling softly, she said, "You stayed." I told her I did, and then we didn't say much more, just sat together, letting the silence say everything else. That morning marked a shift, not dramatic or loud, but real. I began to see Ellen not just as someone I visited, but as someone I returned to. The guest room became a place I stayed once, or twice a week. We didn't make a big deal out of it. She never asked for more than I was ready to give, and I never made promises I couldn't keep. But every time I walked up her porch, something in me settled, something in me healed. It's strange how easily a house can start to feel like home, even when you know it technically isn't yours. That's what Ellen's place became for me, a quiet, weathered sanctuary tucked away from the noise and numbness of the outside world. I still kept my small apartment on the other side of town, but most mornings I found myself waking up in her guest room, blinking at the way sunlight spilled across the floral curtains and breathing in the scent of fresh linens and brewed coffee drifting from the kitchen. It was never assumed I would stay, never demanded, never even scheduled. It just kept happening, like instinct. I'd bring groceries, and then a conversation would start, and then maybe I'd help her tidy up or carry a few things to storage, and then almost without fail dinner would unfold. And afterward, she'd look at me in that soft way and say, "You don't have to rush off." And somehow I never did. There was a rhythm to our days now, one that didn't need defining. It had fallen into something real, something not quite romantic, but far deeper than friendship. It wasn't lust. It wasn't infatuation. It was something solid, something stitched together through time spent, truths shared, silences respected. And despite the differences in our ages, backgrounds, and paths through life, it was undeniable. When I wasn't there, I found myself missing the click of her kettle, the way her hands smoothed the tablecloth without even thinking, the way she still wrote shopping lists by hand with a pen that sometimes didn't work right. She never said she missed me when I was gone, but I could feel it. In the way she'd send a text saying the bread she liked was on sale, or that her favorite radio program had played a song she thought I'd enjoy, and I'd respond with a photo of a flower blooming on the street or a note saying I'd be by. With more apples soon, even if she hadn't asked. But underneath all of this quiet sweetness, I started to feel something else stirring, something heavier. It crept in during the in-between moments, when she'd drift off on the couch for just a bit too long, or when her fingers fumbled with a jar lid she used to open easily. There was a fragility to her movements now, not always, but often enough. That I noticed. One evening, I saw her pause at the stairs, one hand pressed lightly to her side, a flicker of pain flashing across her face before she masked it with a smile. I didn't press her on it, not yet, but it stayed with me, like a warning bell in the distance. Then came the morning. I found her sitting at the kitchen table with her head resting in her hands. It wasn't like her to be up that early without the smell of something brewing. There was no music playing, no candle lit, no warm hum of domestic life around her. Just stillness. She looked up when I approached, and her eyes were red-rimmed, her expression pained in a way that made my stomach drop. She said it started with fatigue a few weeks ago, then headaches, then confusion. "Sometimes I forget why I walked into a room," she said, trying to smile through it. At first I thought I was just tired, but her voice broke. "I went to the doctor last week." My heart thudded in my chest. She looked down at her hands. They found something, a mass, in my brain. The words hung in the air like smoke, curling into every corner of the room, staining it with a new kind of silence. I didn't know what to say. I reached across the table and covered her hand with mine. She didn't cry, not then. She just exhaled, like she'd been holding her breath for too long. "I didn't want to tell you yet," she said. "I didn't want to change things." I told her that nothing was going to change how I saw her, how I showed up, but we both knew that wasn't entirely true. Illness has a way of rearranging everything, whether you want it to or not. Over the next few days, the atmosphere in the house shifted. There was still tea and movies and soft laughter, but now there was also paperwork on the coffee table and pill bottles near the sink. She tried to keep things normal, and I did my best to follow her lead, but the knowledge of what was coming hovered above us like a ceiling about to crack. One night, after she had gone to bed early, I stayed up in the sunroom, staring out into the garden that had grown quiet for the season. The lilies hadn't come back, just as she predicted. The rosemary bush was still holding on. I sat there thinking about how temporary everything was, this house. This time, this strange and beautiful connection we had stumbled into. And yet, despite the sorrow building inside me, I didn't feel like running. Felt the opposite, in fact, like I needed to stay. Not just for her. For me too. That week I started staying over more consistently. I rearranged my work schedule, picked up fewer orders, and kept groceries stocked in her kitchen before she even had to ask. I drove her to her next doctor's appointment, waited in the car, and held her hand when she came out and said they wanted to run more tests. She thanked me for being there with her eyes more than her words. One evening, as we sat together listening to one of her old records, she rested her head against my shoulder and whispered, "You've made this time less scary." I kissed the top of her head without thinking. It wasn't romantic. It was reverence. Quiet way of saying, "I see you. I'm here." We never labeled what we were, never felt the need to. But there was love between us, gentle, patient, and unspoken. And in that quiet house filled with candlelight and shadows of memory, that love grew, even as her body began to betray her, even as the doctor's language grew more clinical and less hopeful. Ellen remained herself, strong, kind, and quietly resilient. And I remained beside her, not as a visitor anymore, but as someone who had found a home not in walls, but in her presence. As winter began to press its cold fingers against the windows of Ellen's house, our world contracted even more tightly. Around the warmth within those walls, outside, the trees stood bare and solemn, their limbs reaching upward like prayers lost in a gray sky. Inside, however, the days carried on in slow, deliberate beats, steeped in tea, wrapped in flannel. Colored by candlelight and soft music playing in the background, Ellen moved a little more carefully now. Her steps were more measured, her silences stretched longer, but never once did she let her spirit crumble. There was still a steadiness in her, an old strength that hadn't diminished, just shifted. She still smiled when I walked through the door, still asked how my day was before saying anything about hers. Still made sure the house smelled of cinnamon or cloves or something comforting, as though the scent itself might shield us both from whatever was coming. I found myself falling into rituals with her. Every morning I'd wake in the guest room and make coffee before she stirred, sitting in the sunroom with the mug cupped in both hands as the sky yawned open. Sometimes she would join me in her robe, sitting across from me in that worn armchair, the light catching the silver in her hair just right, making her look at once luminous and grounded. Other days, she would sleep in longer, and I would quietly tidy the kitchen, water the plants, or light the fireplace. There was something sacred about those small routines, in changing, anchoring, keeping us steady even as life outside our walls continued in its chaotic blur. It was during one of those mornings, as the kettle whistled and a low wind through, the trees outside that Ellen mentioned her daughter for the first time in weeks. She was sitting at the kitchen table, wrapped in her wool blanket, hands around her tea like she was drawing heat from the cup into her bones. Her voice was soft, almost tentative when she said, "I think I'd like to write to Anna." Looked up from where I was slicing fruit. She hadn't spoken her daughter's name aloud in a long time. Not since the day she first told me about the fight. The way they had parted without resolution years ago, too many things left unsaid. "I don't know if she'll respond," she added, eyes fixed on the steam rising from her cup. "Think I'd like to try." I told her it was a good idea. I told her that no matter what, reaching out was brave, and it meant something. She nodded, her expression unreadable, and disappeared into her room. A few minutes later, she returned with an old leather notebook and began writing at the kitchen table, pen scratching quietly against the paper. I didn't hover. I just let her be. But I saw the way her shoulders eased slightly as the pages turned, and when she finished, she folded the letter slowly, as if it were made of something fragile. She handed it to me without a word, and I drove it to the post office that afternoon like it was carrying something sacred. The days that followed were quiet, a little more solemn, a little more filled with waiting. We didn't speak much of the letter after that, but I knew it was on her mind. I could see it in the way she stared out the window longer than usual, or how she paused just a second too long before checking the mailbox. I wanted to ask if she was okay, but I knew better. Some silences aren't meant to be filled. Some waiting must be done alone, even if you're not physically alone. I stayed near, keeping our routines intact, giving her space when she needed it, and presence when she didn't. It was on a Saturday morning brighter than most, the sun finally slicing through the cold, that a reply came. She found it herself, tucked in the stack of mail near the front door. I saw her fingers tremble as she held the envelope. She stared at it for a long time, standing there in the hallway, before retreating to the sunroom and closing the door. Gently behind her, I waited in the kitchen, unsure what to do with myself. The minutes stretched. I paced, made tea, reheated some soup we hadn't touched from the night before. Eventually, she reappeared. Her face was puffy, but peaceful, eyes red, but no longer strained. She wrote back. She said simply, I nodded, waiting. She said she missed me, that she's sorry too, that she'd like to visit soon if I'm up for it. A silence passed. Between us, rich and full of the weight of reconciliation. I told her I'd like that, Ellen added, her voice breaking. I stepped forward and held her then, more tightly than I ever had, not as a lover, not as a friend, but as someone who understood what it meant to carry hope for so long. It started to feel like a burden, and then, miraculously, to feel it answered, after that, there was a lightness in the house I hadn't felt before. Ellen moved through her days with a touch more brightness, and I could see a subtle shift in her posture, in the rhythm of her speech. She began pulling old photo albums from her shelves, flipping through them with a sort of nostalgia that was less bitter now. She told me stories about Anna as a child, about the time they got caught in a summer storm and danced in the rain, laughing until they couldn't breathe. She showed me drawings Anna had made in elementary school, little crayon stick figures, labeled me and Mom in shaky letters. These weren't just stories. They were gifts. She was letting me hold parts of her life that had been locked away, and I held them with care. One evening, a few days after the letter, she handed me a key. Just one, plain brass, without a label. In case I'm sleeping when you arrive. She said. I turned it over in my hand, feeling the weight of what it meant. It wasn't about convenience. It was about trust, about permanence. I took it and said thank you, but I think she saw the emotion in my eyes that I didn't speak aloud. It was the first time in years that someone had made me feel like I belonged somewhere, like my presence mattered beyond utility. I wasn't just delivering groceries anymore. I was delivering comfort, consistency, companionship, and receiving all of it in return. That night, she drifted off beside me on the couch, her head against my arm, and her breath soft and even. I realized that love doesn't always announce itself with fireworks or grand gestures. Sometimes it arrives in slow waves, in borrowed blankets, in shared glances, in late-night silences. Sometimes it whispers rather than shouts, but it's no less powerful. And in that house, in that moment, with the fire crackling low and her hand resting gently on mine, I knew I was exactly where I needed to be. Time has a peculiar way of bending inside a home that's filled with tenderness and waiting. The days no longer felt linear in Ellen's house. They seemed to exist in a looping rhythm of moments that blurred softly into each other. One morning, I'd be helping her tie her scarf before she stepped outside to catch some sun in the garden. The next, I'd be feeding her soup from a tray because she hadn't gotten out of bed at all. Some days she would surprise me with bursts of energy, insisting on rearranging the bookshelf or pulling out old cookbooks to flip through. Other days she would sit in the window seat, head resting against the glass, too quiet for too long. And I stayed always, because by now it wasn't even a question. My place wasn't somewhere else anymore. It was here, beside her, inside this. A space that had slowly become ours. The letter from Anna had opened something in Ellen, something that had long been sealed behind pride and pain. They began to text each other every few days, sometimes short messages, sometimes long ones. At first, Ellen would read me the texts, voice filled with a cautious joy, unsure if this renewal would hold. But as the days passed, her comfort grew. One afternoon she smiled, set her phone on the table, and said, "She wants to come visit next weekend, just for the day." There was a pause, and then she added, "Would you be here when she does?" I nodded without hesitation. I could tell. It wasn't about needing me to meet her daughter. It was about not facing the day alone. In the days leading up to Anna's visit, Ellen transformed the house with a quiet, steady energy I hadn't seen in weeks. She changed the curtains in the guest room, aired out the linens, rearranged photos. On the mantel, she spent one afternoon choosing which teacups to use, another day baking a cake, even though it tired her more than she let on. I helped with the cleaning, the cooking, the errands, but mostly I stood back and let her own the moment. It wasn't mine to lead. It was hers to reclaim. The morning Anna arrived was unseasonably warm. A pale sun filtered through the trees. And Ellen stood by the window waiting, her hand gently resting on her chest, as if to steady her own breath. When the car pulled into the driveway, she turned to me briefly, her eyes brimming but steady. I placed my hand on her shoulder, gave a slight nod, then stepped into the kitchen to give them space. From the other room I heard the door open, a pause, and then the muffled sound of footsteps and voices, soft at first, tentative then slowly, with emotion uncoiling like long-stored light. I didn't eavesdrop. I didn't need to. Light. In the air, the fragile reunion of two hearts that had drifted but never truly separated. After a while, Ellen called me in. Anna was sitting at the kitchen table, her eyes red but her smile warm. Looked so much like her mother it nearly startled me. Same eyes, same gentle curve to the mouth, but her presence carried a nervous energy that made me immediately want to put her at ease. Ellen introduced me simply, with a calm pride in her voice. "This is Caleb. He's been helping me through a lot." Anna extended her hand, and I shook it gently, nodding. "Thank you for being here," she said quietly. "I've heard a lot about you." We shared a polite laugh, and just like that, the atmosphere softened. The rest of the afternoon flowed with surprising ease. We ate the cake Ellen had made, listened to old records, looked through photo albums that Ellen had set out on purpose. Anna asked questions. Ellen answered some, avoided others, and they both let it be okay. Later, while Ellen rested on the couch wrapped in her favorite quilt, Anna and I stood in the kitchen. She washed. I dried. Quiet rhythm. Then she spoke. I was angry for her. "Long time," she said, "and stubborn. I thought if I stayed away, she'd understand how much she'd hurt me. I stayed quiet, waiting. But life's short, isn't it? You think you have time, and then suddenly you don't." When she wrote me, I felt like the universe had cracked open a little to let us try again. I looked at her and saw the weight she carried, regret, hope, guilt, love, all tangled together. "You're good for her," she added. "She seems lighter." Even with everything going on, I didn't have a response for that. Not one that felt adequate.
Add.
So I just nodded, and we continued our quiet work. until the dishes were done after. Anna left that evening. Ellen sat beside me in the sunroom and said nothing for a long time. We watched the light fade across the trees, and eventually she turned to me and whispered, "That meant the world." I reached for her hand and held it gently. I didn't need to tell her I knew. She could feel it in the way I stayed. As the days passed after that visit, Ellen seemed to settle into a new kind of peace. Not free from pain or fear, but more anchored, more whole. She and Anna continued to talk, even planning another visit in a few weeks. It gave Ellen something to look forward to, something beyond doctor's appointments and new medications. And for me, it gave purpose to my presence that deepened beyond anything I'd known before. One night, during a storm that rattled the old windows and made the lights flicker, we sat by the fireplace with only candles to illuminate the room. Ellen was quiet, curled up with her knees pulled close. The power went out completely, and in the sudden hush, she reached for my hand and said, "I'm not afraid of what's coming, Caleb. Not anymore. I just don't want to face it alone." Her voice didn't tremble. It didn't carry fear. Just honesty. I squeezed her hand and told her I wasn't going anywhere, and I meant it. Not in the vague, well-meaning way people often promise things they can't keep. I meant it in the marrow of my bones, because by now this house wasn't just where I spent my nights. It was the place where I had rediscovered what it meant to show up for someone, to hold space for their pain, to witness their joy, to be a part of their life without needing to define exactly what you were. I had come here to deliver groceries, and somehow I had ended up delivering something else entirely, as February waned and the first tentative hints of spring hovered at the edges of every breeze. Ellen's home began to change again, not in its layout or in the decor, but in its energy. Something about the house began to exhale, as though the weight that had gripped its beams and floorboards was lifting ever so slightly. And maybe that wasn't just about Elon's improved mood or the brief string of warmer days. Maybe it was about presence. Maybe it was about love in all its quiet, durable forms. Because by then, the routines we'd built together weren't just habits, they were threads in a fabric we had both stitched together from fear and comfort. From silence and kindness, every gesture, every meal shared or blanket tucked or book read aloud while she dozed, it had all become a language between us. A language that said, "I see you. I'm here. You matter." Her health wasn't improving. Not really. The doctors had been measured in their updates, some things had stabilized. But there were still questions they couldn't answer, and treatments they couldn't guarantee. Yet even in that uncertainty, Ellen had grown stronger in a different way. She had reclaimed parts of herself through forgiveness, through the reemergence of her daughter, and, I suppose, through me. Not because I saved her. I never felt like a savior. But because I stayed. Sometimes that's the miracle, someone choosing to stay when it would be easier to go. There was one evening, not long after Anna's second visit, when we sat outside. Wrapped in thick blankets, watching the stars blink open one by one, Len had insisted she wanted fresh air, even if the night was still cold. We brought out the patio chairs and made a little nest of pillows and throws, and I lit candles on the table between us for warmth and atmosphere. The moon was nearly full, the kind of moon that casts silver light on everything it touches, turning the ordinary into something almost holy. Ellen looked up at it and said, "When I was a girl, I used to believe the moon followed me. I'd ride in the back of my parents' car and watch it through the window, thinking it was looking out for me." Oh. She chuckled softly, then added, "Sometimes I still like to think that." Her voice was wistful, not sad, and I found myself wanting to protect that version of her, the girl who believed in the moon, in the quiet that followed. I found myself asking something I hadn't dared voice before. "Are you scared?" I asked. She didn't answer right away. Then she said, "Not of dying, really, but of disappearing, being forgotten, of leaving behind a mess for someone else to clean up." She turned to look at me, her eyes shimmering. "That's what keeps me up at night. Not the end itself, but the aftermath. The silence I'll leave behind." I reached for her hand and held it tightly, and that touch was my answer. "I won't let you disappear. From then on, I made it my quiet mission to remember everything. The way she hummed when she cooked. The stories she told about her childhood. Dog named Ginger. The recipe she always got wrong, but made anyway. The way her eyes lit up at certain old songs. I wrote things down in a small notebook I kept in my coat pocket. Not for anyone else. Just for me. Just in case. One morning, I walked into the kitchen to find her dancing. It's not a big twirling dance, but a slow, swaying motion to an old jazz tune playing on her record player. She didn't notice me at first. Her eyes were closed, her arms gently outstretched, moving like she was holding someone invisible. And maybe she was. Maybe it was memory. Maybe it was joy. Maybe it was her own soul, stretching and swaying in the body it still had for now. I didn't interrupt. I just stood there, watching her exist in that moment so completely. And something about that image stayed with me. Her dancing alone, unafraid, holding nothing and everything all at once. Later that day, she asked me to help her go through some boxes in the attic. They were filled with papers, photos, mementos of a life fully lived. She sat up there for hours, sorting through decades. She laughed at some memories, cried at others. We found a box of old letters from her parents. Ticket stubs from concerts long past, a pressed flower between the pages of a book. I want to get my things in order, she said, her tone practical but gentle. I don't want Anna or you to have to deal with all this chaos later. I told her it wasn't chaos. It was her life. It was beautiful. We started labeling things, setting aside what to keep, what to donate, what to pass on. She told me who should get what and why, and I listened carefully, committing it all to memory, promising myself I'd honor it exactly. At one point, she held up a photo of herself in her 20s, hair wild, smile huge, eyes bright with hope. She stared at it for a long moment and whispered, "I still feel like her, some days." And I said, "You still are her, just wiser." The next evening, as we ate dinner in front of the fireplace, Ellen told me something I didn't expect. You know, if someone had told me a year ago that a man delivering my groceries would become the most constant presence in my life, I would have laughed. She smiled, setting her fork down. "But you did, and I'm so glad you did." I looked at her, this woman who had let me into her life with no expectations, and I realized how deeply she had woven herself into mine. We hadn't kissed. We hadn't defined anything, and yet there was intimacy in everything we did. Love didn't need a label. It was in the way I adjusted the thermostat before she got cold, in the way she saved the last piece of pie for me, in the way we sat in silence and didn't feel the need to fill it. That night, as she turned in and I stayed behind to clean up, I found a note on the counter written in her neat, slanting handwriting. It said simply, "You've given me more comfort than I knew I needed. Thank you for staying." I folded it carefully and placed it in my wallet. I didn't need grand declarations. I just needed that, her words, her trust, her quiet gratitude. And as I sat there alone, the fire dimming to glowing coals, I realized something else. I wasn't waiting for a confession, or a change in our dynamic, or even a future we could plan. I was here for now, for as long as she needed. And that was enough. The days continued, like the slow turning of pages in a beloved, well-worn novel, each chapter holding its own quiet weight, its own collection of truths. With each passing moment, I felt more like a chapter in Ellen's life too, not a visitor anymore, not a footnote. There was something almost holy in the ordinary now, folding her laundry while the wind hummed at the windows, refilling her teacup before she asked, knowing which side of the bed creaked and how to ease her sore knees when she forgot to take. It's slow, and yet for all the ease and rhythm we had grown into, there was always a soft ache that trailed behind us, like a distant bell, because we both knew this season of togetherness had a ceiling, and the ceiling was time. One afternoon, Ellen sat with her sketchbook open on the kitchen table. I hadn't seen her draw since the week we met. The pages had remained mostly untouched, the pencil worn down but unused. But that day, the light streaming in from the back window cast her in that golden hush that made everything seem a little more alive. She was sketching a view from the sunroom, the outline of her rose bushes, bare from the cold but still dignified, with little hints of green whispering their intention to return. I asked what inspired her to pick it up again, and she shrugged. Maybe I just wanted to remember how things looked before they bloomed again. There was more behind the words. I could feel it, but I didn't press. Some thoughts are too tender to pry open. Instead, I pulled out my own notebook, the one I had been quietly filling with the details of Hertha, small moments that deserved to be remembered, even if no one else would ever see them. It struck me that we were both trying to document something fleeting, to preserve the shape of a moment before time made it blur. That same week, Ellen received another letter. Not from Anna this time, but from an old friend she hadn't spoken to in over a decade. Apparently Anna had reached out on her behalf, sending photos and updates, and the friend had written back with warmth and surprise. I watched Ellen read it in the living room, glasses low on her nose, her face pulling into a slow smile. "It's strange," she said, "how life circles back. Just when you think the book has closed on certain people, they show up again in the margins." She looked thoughtful, almost amused, and I found myself smiling too. The house, once so quiet and still, now buzzed softly with renewed connections. It was as if Ellen had opened a door inward, and others had begun to find their way in again. One night, as rain tapped gently against the windows, and we sat with blankets draped over our legs, Ellen asked me a question I hadn't expected. "Do you believe in soulmates?" I turned to look at her, unsure of how to answer right away. I'd never been the type to speak in grand, poetic ideas about love. My life had been built around practicality, around doing what needed to be done, and not hoping for too much beyond that. But with her, things had shifted. My beliefs had softened around the edges. "I don't know," I finally said. "I think some people are meant to cross paths, and maybe they don't always stay, but they change you." She nodded slowly, her gaze drifting toward the fire. "Maybe that's all we need," she said. "Someone who sees us, truly sees us, before we forget how to see ourselves." Her words lingered with me that night as I lay awake in the guest room, the soft hum of the house settling around me like a lullaby. I thought about all the things I had stopped noticing in my own life before Ellen, the sound of wind in the trees, the taste of properly brewed tea, the feeling of being needed not because of what I could fix, but because of who I was when I stayed. Somehow, in caring for her, I had found pieces of myself I didn't even know I'd misplaced. The next morning, I woke to the smell of bread baking. Ellen had woken before me, which hadn't happened in weeks. I found her in the kitchen, apron on, flour dusting her hands, a wide smile on her face. "Thought I'd surprise you," she said. "This old recipe came to me in a dream." Bread was imperfect, slightly too dense, a little underbaked in the middle, but I'd never tasted anything more meaningful. We laughed about it, made fresh tea, and sat on the porch in the crisp air. That morning felt like a gift. It's unnecessary, but deeply appreciated. Like the universe had slipped us a bonus chapter we hadn't expected. It was also around that time that I began sleeping on the couch more often than the guest bed. Not because Ellen asked, but because it felt right. Some nights she'd fall asleep early, and I'd stay up reading in the living room, not wanting to disturb her. Other nights she'd fall asleep next to me during one of our movie marathons, and I wouldn't have the heart to move. Sometimes she would wake in the middle of the night, groggy, a little disoriented, and reach out, and I'd be there. Just there. She never said anything about it, and neither did I, but it became part of us, part of the rhythm we didn't question. The house took on the smell of lavender and lemon in March. Ellen had ordered a batch of candles from a local maker, and the scent drifted into every room like spring announcing its arrival ahead of the blooms. The windows were open more often now, letting in light and air, and the birds had returned to perch on the wires out back. She began to plan little things: a walk to the park with Anna, a visit from her friend Sharon, who lived 2 towns over. She even started leaving little notes on the fridge, listing what groceries we needed. Like we were roommates and not two people orbiting something much deeper. But with all the new life and energy came moments of stillness too. Moments where Ellen would press a hand to her chest and close her eyes, or excuse herself mid-sentence and take a long breath by the window. I didn't ask questions. I simply waited, near enough to help if needed, but far enough not to intrude. She always came back to me with a soft smile and a shake of her head. "Still here," she'd whisper. And each time, I'd nod like it was the most precious affirmation in the world. One evening, as the sun set behind the hills and cast golden streaks across the floorboards, Ellen looked at me with a question in her eyes.
Ow!
She didn't say it aloud, but I knew. And without needing a conversation, I pulled the spare blanket over her lap, sat beside her, and leaned my shoulder gently against hers. That was our answer. That we didn't need to name it. That this, whatever it was real enough, sacred enough, to carry us through whatever came next. By the time April arrived, the cherry blossoms that lined Ellen's quiet street began to bloom in soft explosions of pink and white, a delicate canopy that danced gently in the breeze and coated the sidewalks with petals like gentle confetti. The world outside her home had started to brighten, both in color and in pace. Neighbors who had barely stepped out all winter were suddenly trimming hedges or sipping coffee on their porches. The seasons were turning again. And while the world moved forward in its usual cyclical rhythm, something between Ellen and me had shifted into a slower, deeper orbit. It was as if we had stepped into our own time zone, one defined not by minutes or calendars, but by presence. And in that presence, there was something sacred one Thursday afternoon. While I was tending to her small garden beds, pulling weeds, adding soil, trimming back the frostbitten, Aegisalon sat nearby under the shade of a patio umbrella. The sketchbook in her lap, legs wrapped in a blanket despite the warmth in the air. She wasn't drawing anything in particular, just making soft loops and lines like she was letting her hands speak for her spirit. Occasionally she'd pause to sip lemonade or glance up and smile, and I'd feel that now familiar pull in my chest, that tether of quiet emotion that no longer surprised me. It had grown slowly, like roots beneath the surface, steady and patient. I hadn't named it, not really, neither had she, but it existed all the same. That day, she told me a story from her 20s about a backpacking trip through Spain. How she and a friend had nearly gotten stranded in a hillside village and were rescued by a goat farmer who didn't speak a word of English. I listened, smiling at her animated expressions and the way her voice lilted with memory. I could almost see her younger self in her eyes. When she was done, she laughed to herself and said, "There was a time I thought I'd live out of a suitcase forever. I used to think commitment would pin me down like a butterfly under glass." Her voice trailed off for a moment before she added, "Funny how life has a way of folding your wings for you anyway." That sentence stayed with me long after the sun dipped below the treetops and the garden was watered and packed up for the day. I thought about the ways we bend and shift. Over time, the ways our ambitions soften, our definitions of happiness evolve. Ellen had once chased the horizon, and now she found peace in a front porch and a grocery boy who had become something else entirely. And me, I had never chased anything, but somehow without ever running, I had arrived exactly where I was meant to be. That weekend, Anna visited again, and this time she brought her son. Ellen's grandson, lanky 11-year-old, with sharp eyes and a cautious demeanor, clung to his mother at first, clearly unsure of this new environment. But Ellen welcomed him with such quiet grace that by the afternoon he was building a tower of couch cushions in the living room, while Ellen watched from her recliner, eyes twinkling. I stepped out for a while to give them space and returned later to the sound of laughter reel. Unguarded laughter, and it felt like music. Anna thanked me privately in the kitchen. She said, "You've given her more than I ever could have. And I'm not talking about care. I'm talking about joy. Thank you for not treating her like she's fading." Her voice cracked a little, and I simply nodded. There was nothing to say that wouldn't sound smaller than the truth as spring bloomed around us. Ellen's condition remained relatively stable, though the doctor had been clear it was the eye of the storm, not the end of it. Some days she had energy, and other days she barely moved from her bed, but her spirit had changed. She didn't speak of endings anymore. She spoke of days. The day we would plant marigolds in the front yard, the day we'd watch the neighbor's cat give birth, a running joke since she claimed she could tell it, was close. The day she'd teach me how to make her mother's tomato soup from scratch. She made a list of things she wanted to do, not because she thought she'd do them all, but because she wanted to have something to look forward to. One of the most unexpected days came when she insisted we go out for lunch. A real outing, not just a stroll or a drive. I hesitated at first. She hadn't been more than a few blocks in months, but she was determined. We chose a small cafe near the edge of town, one with patio seating and wind chimes that sang lazily. In the breeze, she wore a wide-brimmed hat and her sunglasses, and I helped her into a seat beneath the canopy. People passed us by without much notice, which was perfect. We shared a sandwich, sipped iced tea, and talked about everything and nothing. At one point, she looked out toward the street and whispered, "I forgot what the world feels like when it's moving around you. It's beautiful. Loud, but beautiful." On the way home, she rested her head against the window of my truck and hummed softly to a tune on the radio. It was one of those old songs from the 70s, something slow and sentimental. I didn't know the words, but I didn't need to. That ride home, with her beside me, felt like something worth bottling up and saving forever. That night, as I tucked her in and adjusted the pillows behind her back, she reached out and held my wrist. Not tightly, just enough to still me. Then she said, "You know, the night you stayed for the first time, that night I asked you to stay until morning. I was afraid you'd feel sorry for me, that you'd see me as weak. I didn't know what else to say. I just didn't want to be alone anymore." I met her gaze, and she continued, "But you didn't make me feel small. You made me feel seen and safe." I wanted to respond, to tell her what she had given me in return, but the words got caught somewhere between my chest and throat. So instead, I bent down and kissed her forehead, gentle and deliberate, like sealing a promise. And later, when I lay on the couch listening to the rhythm of her breathing down the hall, I found myself awake again, not from worry or restlessness, but from the sheer intensity of feeling, because for the first time in my life, I understood something that had always eluded me. Love doesn't need to be loud to be real. Sometimes it's the quiet presence, the warm meal, the folded blanket, the hand that doesn't let go, the unspoken agreement that says, "As long as you need me, I'll be here." And so I stayed. The rhythm of the days continued, soft and steady, like the gentle ticking of a clock you almost forget is there until you stop to listen. By now, our lives had become a series of shared moments, subtle routines that didn't demand much, but meant everything. Ellen would rise a little later than she used to, and I would already be in the kitchen preparing breakfast. Always light, always warm, always with a mug of tea waiting. She'd shuffle in, wrapped in her cardigan, hair loose around her shoulders, and we'd greet each other without words. A nod, a small smile, a glance that said more than any morning greeting ever could. Sometimes she'd sit at the table, sketching, quietly, or watching the birds outside the window, while I read the paper or organized her medications. Other days she would lean against the doorframe just to watch me move. Like the very presence of someone else beginning the day before her gave her peace. One morning, the newspaper I picked up had a small article about a local art exhibit in town, an open gallery showcasing works from local seniors. I almost skipped over it, but something about the image caught my eye. A pencil sketch of a window, sunlight spilling through it, soft lines like the ones I'd seen Ellen draw in her own sketchbook. I folded the page carefully and tucked it under the magnet on her fridge. That afternoon, while I was sorting through a pile of blankets to take to the laundromat, she noticed it. She stood there reading the blurb for a long time before quietly saying she hadn't stepped foot in a gallery in years. Her voice wasn't sad, just far away, like she was remembering someone she used to be. I asked her if she wanted to go. She didn't answer right away, but later that evening, she left her sketchbook open on the coffee table with a small penciled drawing of her old studio space. Quiet answer, subtle but clear. So that weekend we went. The exhibit wasn't grand, just a converted storefront near Main Street with wooden floors that creaked and spotlights mounted along exposed beams. But inside, there was magic. Every piece had a story behind it. Acrylic landscapes, charcoal portraits, watercolors of childhood homes. People milled about slowly, whispering to one another, sipping lukewarm cider from plastic cups. Len moved carefully through the space. pausing before each painting with that familiar tilt of her head, the one I recognize now as her way of listening to the art, to the artist, to something deeper within herself. At one point, she stopped in front of a painting of a field at dusk, brushstrokes wild and thick, colors dark and moody. She stared at it for a long time, then said under her breath, "This is what it felt like when he left." She didn't explain who. I didn't ask. The moment passed, but her words stayed. That evening, back at home, she was quiet, not distant, just turned inward. I gave her space, made dinner, kept the lights low, played some soft Ella Fitzgerald in the background. After we ate, she surprised me by asking to sit on the floor. I helped her down gently, arranging pillows and blankets until she was comfortable. We leaned back against the couch, side by side, looking up at the ceiling like it was a canvas. "You ever think about the first time you felt truly seen?" she asked. I thought about it. About my childhood, about long-forgotten friendships, about moments that flickered like distant lanterns. "I think maybe it hasn't happened until now," I said. And she smiled, her eyes wet but peaceful. Same. There was a day not long after that when I found her crying in the hallway. Not loud sobs, not hysteria, just quiet, steady tears. Falling onto the carpet, while she held a small envelope in her hand, I moved slowly, not wanting to startle her, and sat beside her on the floor. She passed me the envelope, and I saw it was from her sister, someone she hadn't spoken to in almost 20 years. Inside was a letter filled with regret, with apologies for old wounds that had never been closed. Ellen read parts of it aloud between breaths, her voice shaking but steadying with each word. It was the kind of letter that comes too late to fix the past, but just in time to offer peace. She didn't say whether she would write back, but she folded the letter neatly and placed it in a small wooden box on her nightstand later that night. That box, I realized, was where she kept things that still mattered. A ring, a photo of Anna as a toddler, pressed leaf. And now this letter. One sunny afternoon, Ellen surprised me again. She asked me to help her rearrange the furniture in the sunroom. "It's time for a change," she said. "I want to sit differently." We spent the day moving things, sweeping behind old shelves, discovering little relics of the years she'd spent in this home-eneering back. A birthday card, a dried-up pen with a bookstore logo. When we finished, the room felt different. Lighter. Like it had been waiting for this. New configuration all along. She sat in her newly placed chair, the light hitting her face just right, and said, "Now I can see the whole yard." I like watching the world wake up. In the days that followed, that became her favorite spot. I'd find her there most mornings. Blanket draped over her knees, tea in hand, sketchbook nearby. Sometimes she'd wave at passing neighbors. Sometimes she'd doze off. Once, I caught her singing softly to herself an old lullaby, I think. She looked up when she noticed me watching and said, "This part of life, it's not what I expected. But maybe it's what I needed." I think about that a lot. Expectations fall away when presence takes their place. How being with someone, really being with them, can be more healing than any treatment or miracle. Ellen and I had become a kind of mirror for each other. I reminded her she was still here, still whole. She reminded me that I could be more than the man who dropped off groceries, more than someone who drifted from job to job, place to place. She made me feel anchored, needed, and not in the way that drains, but in the way that fills. That night, as the rain returned and tapped gently against the windows once again, Ellen called out softly after I'd turned off the lights. I returned to her doorway, half asleep, and she looked at me, her eyes reflecting the low hallway light. "Would you mind just sitting with me for a while?" I nodded and stepped in, sitting in the chair by her bed. She didn't say anything more, just reached her hand out, and I took it. We sat like that for what felt like hours. No need for words. Just two people in the quiet where time didn't matter and nothing needed fixing. Just staying. Just being as May unfurled its green banners across the hills and warmed the air with its gentle breeze. The tempo of life inside Ellen's house seemed to sync with the season. Mornings grew longer, filled with the hum of ceiling fans and bird song through open windows, while afternoons slowed into soft silences broken only by the clink of teacups or the scratch of her pencil on paper. There was something undeniably tender about those days, an intimacy woven from repetition and quiet understanding. Though Ellen's health had started to waver again in subtle ways, longer naps, occasional dizzy spells, hands that trembled just a bit more, she faced them with the kind of quiet grace I had come to associate with her. Not once did she speak of fear. If anything, she became more curious, more willing to share stories, more interested in the textures of memory than in the weight of mortality. One afternoon, while I was organizing the pantry, she shuffled into the kitchen with an old, battered photo album tucked under one arm. It was thick with wear, its corners frayed, its cover soft with age. She placed it on the table and motioned for me to sit. We flipped through the pages slowly, each turn revealing frozen moments from decades past, grainy black and white snapshots. Of her parents on their wedding day, sun-bleached images of Ellen and her sister building sandcastles on a California beach, a Polaroid of her holding a paintbrush in her first studio, wild-eyed and laughing. She narrated each image with detail and affection, occasionally pausing to trace the edge of a photo with her finger like it was a fragile relic. When we reached the final pages, I noticed there were long gaps between the photos. The entries thinned out. The dates jumped years at a time. She noticed my hesitation and said, without looking up, "Some years, I just forgot to take pictures. Or maybe I didn't think they were worth remembering." She smiled faintly, then added, "Funny. Now I think those are the years I remember the most clearly." Later that evening, after I had cleaned up dinner and the house had settled into its usual hush, she called me into the living room. On the table beside her chair was a small canvas, blank but for a few soft strokes of color. Her sketchbook lay open beside it, pages fluttering in the breeze from the slightly ajar window. "I want to paint again," she said. "Something real, not just sketches or studies. Something from here." She tapped her chest lightly, just above her heart. I pulled up a chair, and for the next hour, I sat beside her as she began the slow, deliberate process of coaxing life back into the canvas. She didn't say much. She didn't need to. Every brushstroke was a sentence. Every choice of hue, a confession. I realized then that creating wasn't just something she did. It was how she processed. It's how she healed. By the end of the week, a small routine emerged. Every morning, after tea and toast, Ellen would paint. Not for long an hour, maybe two, but with focused intent, she chose subjects from memory, from feeling, from small moments she had tucked away in her mind like pressed flowers. A mug on a windowsill, a stretch of road from a trip she took alone in her 30s, a pair of shoes at the foot of a bed, and once, to my surprise, she painted a pair of hands that looked unmistakably like mine, holding a grocery bag. When I noticed, she smiled without saying anything. That painting stayed on the easel for days, untouched after its completion, like it had said all it needed to. That Sunday, Anna visited again, this time bringing an old camcorder from Ellen's attic. Something they had used during Ellen's younger years to record birthdays and holidays. Anna had digitized some of the footage and brought her laptop to share. We watched together in the living room, me on the floor, Anna on the love seat. Ellen curled in her recliner, beneath a crocheted throw. The screen flickered to life with images of Ellen dancing in a kitchen, twirling a toddler Anna around while music blared in the background. Her laughter echoed through the speakers, younger and louder than I had ever heard. Then came footage of Christmas mornings, beach trips, and once a clip of Ellen arguing passionately with someone off camera, her eyes flashing and her hands waving wildly. "That was your father," she said to Anna with a chuckle. We disagreed on how to cook lasagna. He was wrong, obviously. The laughter that followed felt like a release. It's like opening a window that had been shut too long. After Anna left that evening, Ellen was quieter than usual. She sat for a long time by the open window, watching the trees sway. I joined her after a while, not speaking, just sitting with her in the dwindling light. Eventually she said, "It's strange, watching yourself like that. I see aversion." Of me, I don't quite remember. So loud, so certain. She thought she had all the time in the world. I reached over and gently touched her hand, letting the silence stretch between us like a comforting blanket. She squeezed my fingers once, then let them go. The next few days were filled with small but meaningful tasks. We sorted through boxes in the attic, donating what she no longer needed, and keeping the things that still whispered their importance. We updated her recipe cards, some nearly illegible from age transcribing them into a little notebook I picked. Up at the bookstore, I noticed she had begun humming more, usually without realizing it. Little fragments of lullabies or folk songs from her childhood. And in the evenings, she often lit a single candle and sat quietly in the sunroom, eyes half closed, like she was communing with something sacred. One particularly warm night, I stepped outside to water the garden just after dusk. The air was heavy with the scent of lilacs, and the sky was painted in streaks of orange and purple. And I turned to go back inside. I saw Ellen at the screen door, wrapped in her shawl, watching me. There was something in her expression soft, full, present. I walked up and opened the door for her, and she said, "It's a good evening for sitting out, don't you think?" We sat on the porch for a long time, not speaking much, just listening to the world. The occasional buzz of a passing car, the hum of insects in the bushes, the rustle of leaves. At one point, she leaned her head against my shoulder and whispered, "If I could bottle up this moment and carry it with me, I think I'd never be afraid of anything again." That night, as I tucked her into bed, she asked if I would read to her. I found an old poetry book from her shelf and read by the glow of a small lamp, my voice low and steady. She fell asleep halfway through the third poem, her breathing soft and even. I sat there for a while longer, finishing the page, then turned off the light and closed the door gently behind me in the quiet hallway. With the night stretching ahead and her presence lingering like the scent of lavender, I realized something. I hadn't just become part of her days. She had become part of mine in a way that no one else ever had. Not as a responsibility or a job or even a companion. She had become part of my understanding of the world of time, of love, of what it means to truly share a life with someone, even if only for a season. And I knew then, with a certainty that needed no words, that I wasn't just staying for the night anymore. I was staying for all the mornings we had left. The days moved gently into early summer, and the world outside bloomed in earnest. The trees grew fuller, casting long afternoon shadows across Ellen's driveway, and the air carried the sweet earthy scent of damp grass and warm pavement. Inside, time held a different rhythm. Our days had grown so finely tuned that we could almost predict each other's movements without a word. I knew when she'd want her tea and when she'd ask for an extra pillow behind her back. She knew when I needed a break, a breath, a quiet hour by the back porch with nothing but the hum of cicadas to distract me. We didn't talk about the heaviness we both felt sometimes. We didn't need to. It hovered, sure, but never overtook us. Instead, it existed in the background like a familiar painting we had both decided not to turn toward for now. One afternoon, Ellen surprised me with a request that took a beat longer than usual for me to process. She wanted to go to the lake, the one about 40 minutes out of town where she used to go with her family during the summers when Anna was little. I looked at her, taking in the slight tremble in her fingers and the subtle way her shoulders slouched more than they used to, and for a moment, I hesitated. But her eyes held that look against soft and sure, asking for something she didn't want to have to explain, so we made a plan. The next morning, I packed a picnic with her help. Filled the car with cushions, blankets, and a lightweight folding chair. Ellen dressed in a long, flowing dress and a wide straw hat, her skin already pale from months spent mostly indoors. And we set out just after sunrise. The drive was quiet but not silent. She played music on her old iPod, mostly folk songs, some classic rock, a bit of jazz. Occasionally she'd point out a landmark or recall a memory from a bend in the road. By the time we reached the lake, the sun had fully risen, and the sky stretched out in a pale blue dome above the water, shimmering in long, lazy ripples. We parked under a large oak tree and found a spot with a gentle slope down to the edge. I set up the chair and blanket, made sure she was comfortable, then sat beside her with my feet. Just grazing the cool surface of the lake, she watched the water for a long while without speaking. Then she said almost to herself that it looked smaller than she remembered, but somehow more beautiful. She pointed to a distant dock and told me that's where Anna had learned to swim. Her husband standing waist-deep in the water, coaxing her forward. He had brought peanut butter sandwiches and 2 warm soda, and one year a goose had chased them across the grass. She laughed at the memory, her voice light and bright. For a long time after that, we just sat there, letting the sounds of water, wind, and distant birds fill the spaces between us. Eventually, I unpacked the food, fruit, sandwiches. Some soft cookies Ellen had baked the day before, despite the way it tired her out. We ate slowly, between sips of lemonade, and Ellen leaned back in her chair and closed her eyes. For a moment I thought she'd drifted off, but then she spoke again. She asked if I had ever felt like I'd been given a second chance, even if I hadn't been sure what the first chance was. I said I wasn't sure, but maybe what we were doing now, this life, these days, felt something like that. She nodded, like she understood exactly, and said, "That's what I think this is for me. Not a redo, just an unexpected page I didn't think I'd get to write." As the afternoon wore on, the breeze picked up, and the light shifted to that golden hue. That makes everything look softer, warmer. Ellen stood slowly and asked me to walk with her to the water's edge. I held her arm as we took careful steps over the grass and stones until we reached a small spot where the lake lapped gently at the shore. She stood there looking out, her hand in mine, and after a moment she whispered, "It's still here. After all these years," then more quietly, "So am I." She didn't cry. Neither did I, but the moment held a kind of quiet reverence. Like the world had paused just long enough to acknowledge the courage it took her to return here, to remember without breaking. We didn't stay long after that. The light was fading, and I could tell the trip had taken more out of her than she let on. She slept most of the ride home, her head resting lightly against the seat, her hands clasped in her lap. When we reached her house, I carried the leftover picnic items inside, while she slowly made her way to her recliner. I brought her a warm cloth for her face and a cup of tea, and she held it between both hands as though trying to absorb its heat. She didn't say much that evening, just smiled softly when I checked in on her and thanked me with a squeeze of my hand. She looked tired, but content, as if something that had been unresolved inside her had found its place. The following days were quiet. Ellen rested more than usual, and though she never admitted it outright, I could see the trip had marked a shift. Her steps were slower, her hands colder. The color in her cheeks seemed to fade a little more each morning, but her spirit remained light. She joked when she could, smiled often, and seemed more at peace than I had seen her before. She painted another canvas, this time the lake. It's not exactly as it was, but as she felt it. Deep still, a place holding memory without judgment. It was one of the few pieces she didn't let me see until it was finished. When she did, I stared at it for a long time and then asked if I could frame it. She nodded, and that painting now hangs above the entryway, the first thing you see when you walk into her home. One night not long after, Ellen asked me to bring her the photo album again. We sat together, flipping through the pages by lamplight, and she began placing sticky notes on the backs of certain photos. "For Anna," she'd say, "or give this one to Lucy from church." When I asked what she was doing, she said, "Just making sure the right stories go to the right people." There was no fear in her voice, no sadness, just a calm certainty that spoke louder than any explanation. Later that night, as I helped her to bed, she touched my arm and said she hoped. I knew how much I'd changed her life. I tried to respond, but she held up her hand and said, "No, let me finish." Then she told me something I never expected, that when she first asked me to stay that night weeks ago, she didn't think I would. She thought I'd come up with a polite excuse, do what most people do, step back from discomfort. But I didn't. I stayed. And in doing so, she said, I helped her find something she thought she had lost forever. Not just comfort, but connection. Not just help, but meaning. That night, after she fell asleep, I sat in the hallway for a long time. leaning against the wall, staring at the faint light spilling from under her door. I thought about everything that had led me here, every decision, every grocery run, every quiet moment we'd shared. I didn't know what the future held, or how many more days like this we'd have, but I knew this whatever time we had left, I would be here, not because she needed me, but because I needed her just as much. The softness of June crept in quietly, like a lullaby hummed from the edge of memory. Ellen's house settled deeper into its quiet rhythm, a place where even time seemed to move more gently. She no longer rose before me. Her mornings now began with the glow of sunlight pressing through gauzy curtains, the scent of lemon balm I rubbed between my fingers and placed by her bedside, and the faint jazz playing from the old kitchen radio. Her voice, once strong and lightly amused, had thinned to a whisper some mornings, but there was never a hint of panic. If anything, she moved with a kind of grace that made it feel like this slowness was something sacred, not sorrowful. I began writing things down not just for her, but for myself. I kept a small notebook where I recorded the stories she told, the recipes she shared, the names of people she wanted remembered. I didn't know what I would do with them all, but it felt important to keep them safe, to preserve the weight of her world. Sometimes she'd catch me scribbling notes and smile, teasing that she should charge me for the biography rights. But there was a glimmer of pride in her eyes, too, as if being remembered in this small way gave her a kind of immortality. On one particular morning, after a long rest, she asked me to help her sit outside. The sunroom had become her sanctuary, but today she wanted real air, not filtered through screens or softened by glass. I wheeled out her chair, patted it with cushions, wrapped her shawl around her shoulders, and together we sat beneath the shade of the blooming dogwood tree. The garden hummed with life bees drifting between blossoms, a squirrel darting along the fence, the distant bark of a neighbor's dog. Ellen reached down and ran her fingers through the grass. "This," she whispered, "feels like how I used to dream the end of a good book would be. Not loud, not dramatic, just ... like this." As the days wore on, Ellen slept more. Her naps stretched longer into the afternoon, and often when she woke, her thoughts lingered in dreams. She'd mention people I didn't know, moments I couldn't place, and I learned to just listen, gently anchoring her in the present without pulling her away from whatever warmth those memories offered. I called Anna more frequently, giving her updates, encouraging her to visit soon. She promised she would. Life was complicated, she said. Work was pulling her in too many directions. I didn't push, just said soon is good. Ellen never asked when Anna would come. I think she already knew how daughters and mothers move in quiet orbit, sometimes closer, sometimes far. One evening, as a storm rolled in and the air thickened with the promise of rain, Ellen asked me to leave the windows open. She wanted to hear the thunder. "It used to scare me," she said, "but now it feels like a reminder that the world's still turning." I sat with her as the rain pattered against the sill, as the sky cracked open and then closed again. We didn't speak much. We didn't need to. Her hand rested in mine, her breath slow and steady. I could feel the days narrowing around us, gently closing like the final chapter of a well-loved book. The days that followed felt like pages slowly turning, soft and deliberate, each one bearing a little less weight than the last. Ellen no longer moved about the house on her own. Her steps had become fragile, uncertain, so we adapted. I placed small comforts within arm's reach, her favorite blanket folded neatly on the recliner, her water bottle filled with cucumber, slices beside her bed, the old transistor radio set to her favorite station, humming quietly in the background. Mornings were the gentlest now. I'd help her sit up slowly, fluff the pillows behind her, and open the curtains so the light could bathe the room in gold. She'd smile, sometimes with her eyes still closed, and whisper thanks as though the rising sun were a gift just for her. I read aloud to her most days, sometimes poetry, sometimes from old magazines we found buried in her bookshelves. She didn't always stay awake through it, but she liked the rhythm of my voice, the familiarity of language folding over her like a quilt. On the days she had more strength, we would look through the notebook I'd kept my chronicle of our time together. She'd correct my details or add something I missed, always with a twinkle in her eye, like we were co-authoring a story far bigger than either of us alone. One evening, she asked for something she hadn't in weeks. The photo of her husband, the one that had remained tucked away in her drawer. I found it carefully framed, a little dusty, but still whole. She held it close, studying the lines of his face, the way his smile barely tipped to one side. She told me stories of their early days, how they met at a record store, how he used to bring her flowers every Tuesday without fail, how they once danced in their socks across the kitchen floor with no music playing at all. There was a fondness in her voice, but also a closure. No regret, no longing, just gratitude that it had happened. She set the photo on her bedside table and said, almost like a prayer, "He was my beginning. But you," and then she paused. Catching her breath, "You've been my perfect last chapter." I didn't know how to respond to that, just took her hand and held it, letting the weight of her words settle into my chest like stones in a riverbed, unmoving but forever, reshaping the water around them. That night, I barely slept. I sat in the living room for hours, the quiet pressing against me, the stillness deeper than usual. I thought about the first day I brought groceries to her doorstep, about the way she opened the door, vulnerable and curious, about how a single whispered question had altered the course of both our lives. I realized how much I had changed too. I was no longer just a man trying to earn a living one delivery at a time. I had become someone who bore witness to another person's life, who had been allowed into the most sacred of spaces, the slow unwinding of someone else's days. And somehow, in giving my time and presence, I had received something far greater in return, a clarity I didn't know I was seeking. By the time the last week of June arrived, the house had grown quieter than ever before, not in a mournful way, but like the hush of a sanctuary, sacred, still and heavy with meaning. Ellen no longer made it out to the porch or sunroom. Her days were spent mostly in bed, her frame light beneath the covers, her breathing soft and measured. I adjusted my routine instinctively. I moved slower, spoke softer, and made sure her room remained a calm cocoon of gentle light and warmth. Flowers from the garden filled the vase near her window, simple arrangements of daisies, wild lavender, and marigolds that brought the outside world in, reminding her and me that life still pulsed just beyond the curtains. I would sit beside her and read, sometimes entire pages, other times only a line or two before her eyes would flutter shut. And yet she would always stir if I got up to leave, reaching out faintly as if to tether me to her presence for just a while longer. There was a rhythm to these final days, though the minutes seemed to stretch and fold in unusual ways. Sometimes it felt like time moved too slowly, and other times it rushed by with the strange urgency of something slipping through your fingers. Owen didn't speak much now. Her voice, when it came, was light as breath and often filled with fragments, half-formed thoughts. Remembered places, the names of people who had long since passed. But even in that haze, she knew who I was. She would look at me and smile. And in those smiles was all the acknowledgement I needed. There were no long goodbyes, no grand monologues or revelations. Just this steady, unwavering connection between two souls who had found one another unexpectedly and decided to hold on tight, even as the current shifted. On one particularly still morning, she opened her eyes and asked me to play music. Not anything from her collection. Something new, she whispered. Something I've never heard before. I found a soft instrumental album online, piano. Pieces that rose and fell like tide's end, let the sound drift through the room. She listened with her eyes closed, her lips just barely curved upward, and then said, "Beautiful. Like beginning again." I didn't know what she meant then, but the weight of it stayed with me, etched in the space between us like an unspoken farewell. That evening, Anna finally arrived. She'd taken a red-eye and driven straight from the airport, her eyes red from exhaustion or guilt or both. I met her at the front door and said nothing. There was nothing to say. She moved past me with a kind of urgency, shedding her bags in the hallway, and when she stepped into her mother's room, the silence broke for the first time in days. I gave them their space. I sat in the kitchen and listened to the muffled sound of Anna's voice apologies. Stories, memories too late to be lived, but not too late to be spoken. The sun dipped low outside, and the kitchen filled with a golden haze. I didn't interrupt. Just waited. Hours passed before Anna came out. Her face was pale and wet with tears, but there was peace in her expression. She looked at me, truly looked at me for the first time, and nodded. Not in thanks, not in grief, but in shared understanding. For a brief moment, the weight of everything seemed evenly held between us. Then she disappeared down the hall again, and I returned to the chair outside Ellen's door, where I kept watch over the last quiet hours of a life well lived. The night passed gently, blanketed in stillness, as if the house itself understood the gravity of what it was holding. Anna stayed in the room with Ellen, curling into the armchair with her knees to her chest, silently watching her mother's slow, rhythmic breathing. I remained outside the door, the hallway dimly lit by a single lamp left on in the corner. The quiet was immense, but not empty. It was filled with a presence, a kind of invisible weight that neither suffocated nor frightened me. It was reverence, the kind that only appears in the final chapters of a story that mattered deeply. Around 3 a.m, I rose, stretched my legs, and made my way to the kitchen to warm a pot of tea. The small clink of the mug, the whistle of the kettle, and the creak of the floorboards were the only sounds. And I moved through them with care, aware that even the smallest noise felt intrusive. When I returned to the hallway, Anna was already standing just outside the room. Her face was pale and tired, her expression unreadable. She didn't cry. Instead, she met my eyes and simply said, "She's resting now." Her voice was thick, but there was something in it that suggested acceptance, not defeat. I offered her the mug without a word, and we sat on the floor together, leaning against opposite walls, sipping tea and sharing silence. It was a strange kind of comfort being near someone who had known Ellen in a completely different way, across time and distance. Yet now, sitting together in this moment of stillness, where all versions of Ellen seemed to converge, the hours moved. Slowly, birds began to chirp outside the window before the sky even showed the first hints of light. When the morning finally broke through, it did so gently, casting a soft golden glow through the sheer curtains in the living room. I stood and stretched, my body sore from hours on the floor, and quietly began preparing breakfast for Anna, unsure whether she would want it, but needing something to do with my hands. She joined me not long after, and though we didn't speak much, her presence was grounding. We moved in tandem, passing dishes, pouring juice, placing silverware on the table as if it were a normal morning, though everything about it was not. Around mid-morning, I heard her voice again, not Anna's, Ellen's, faint, barely audible, but enough to pull us both toward her room. She was awake, her eyes clearer than they had been in days, her hands resting gently on the blanket. She looked between us and smiled, not with energy or excitement, but with a kind of quiet satisfaction, as if seeing us there together had stitched something closed. She reached for Anna first, squeezing her daughter's hand with what little strength she had, and then looked toward me. Her lips parted, and though no words came, her expression said everything. Gratitude, peace, maybe even love, in that expansive, non-romantic way that goes deeper than declarations. We stayed with her all day. Anna read aloud from one of her old books, Ellen listening with her eyes closed, the corners of her mouth twitching with each remembered line. I took care of the small things, keeping her water nearby, adjusting her pillows, making sure the fan kept the air moving gently in the room. It wasn't a vigil. It wasn't dramatic. It was simply time, slow, reverent, tender. When she drifted to sleep that night, we didn't know it would be the last. But we treated it with the care of a closing door, softly latched but never locked. The morning after was the kind that arrived with silence louder than sound, the kind of hush that stretched through the entire house like a veil. The first thing I noticed was how still everything felt. No rustle of sheets, no soft clink of a teacup, no distant murmur of music from Ellen's old radio. The sun had risen without drama, casting pale light across the floorboards, but it did not warm the space like it used to. Anna and I had fallen asleep in the living room, her curled on the couch, me in the chair near the window. The air smelled faintly of lavender left over from the diffuser I had filled the night before. And for a moment the world still felt intact until Anna stirred, sat up slowly, and looked toward the hallway. Neither of us said a word. We just knew. Together, we walked to the room, each step heavy with the weight of expectation and knowing. When we entered, Ellen lay exactly as we had left her, peaceful, eyes closed, hands resting lightly on the blanket, her breathing now completely still. There was no fear in her face, no tension, just peace, stillness, completion. Anna broke first. She crumpled into the chair beside the bed and reached for her mother's hand, cool to the touch, and held it as if she could still transfer warmth through sheer will. I stayed back, not wanting to intrude on their goodbye. I watched instead, trying to burn the image into my memory, knowing it would be one of those moments that returned again and again when least expected. After a few long minutes, I stepped forward and gently placed my hand on Anna's shoulder. She didn't look up, but she reached for my hand, and we stood there like that, tethered to one another by shared grief and something else, something wordless and deep, forged through those quiet days that had transformed us both. We didn't rush to call anyone, not yet. We just let the moment be what it was, whole, sacred, suspended in its own time. Eventually, I opened the windows to let the morning air drift in, to let the light touch Ellen's room one final time. The breeze lifted the curtains gently, and for a fleeting second, it felt like she was still part of it, all still in the walls, in the air, in the very breath of the home she had lived and loved in. When the time came, we made the calls. Quiet. Voices. Simple words. Arrangements. Logistics. All the necessary mechanics of loss. That felt so small in comparison to what had actually occurred. Anna handled most of it, her tone steady, but her eyes distant. I supported from the edges, cleaning dishes, answering the door when neighbors stopped by, making sure the house remained calm, orderly, respectful. The hours blurred together in that strange fog that always follows the final goodbye. Everything feels too sharp and too numb all at once. But through it all, there was something else I couldn't quite name. Not relief, not sadness in the conventional sense. It was more like ... fulfillment. As if some invisible promise had been honored. Ellen had not left this world in loneliness or fear. She had left it in the warmth of the home she loved, in the presence of people who cared, with her stories told, and her memories carried forward. That night, after the last visitor had gone, and the house fell quiet again, I stepped outside alone. The stars were out, the sky a deep velvet curtain stretched over the neighborhood. I stood in the driveway where this all began, remembering that first delivery, that hesitant knock on the door, and the whispered invitation that had changed everything in the days that followed. Life continued, around the absence, reshaping itself with quiet resilience. The rhythm of the house changed. Ellen's room, once the heart of everything, now felt like a Chipotlin disturbed and still, holding the echo of her final moments. Anna stayed for the week after, sorting through her mother's things slowly, gently, without any rush to erase her presence. I stayed too, at first out of habit, then out of something deeper, something like obligation, though not one tied to duty. It was more personal than that, rooted in love and honor. We moved around each other like two people who had shared a profound experience but were still learning how to speak about it. Sometimes we did talk short, soft exchanges over breakfast or while folding laundry. Other times, we simply existed in the same space. A quiet companionship, born of mutual reverence for the woman who had brought us together. One afternoon, Anna asked me to help her go through Ellen's notebooks. They were scattered throughout. The shelves, some half filled with garden notes, others with unfinished letters, grocery lists, poetry. There were doodles in the margins, pressed flowers between pages. Reminders scribbled in the kind of handwriting that grows slower with age. We sat cross-legged in the living room, sorting through the collection with quiet smiles and the occasional pause when something caught our breath. She found a note addressed to her short, handwritten, left inside the cover of an old gardening journal. It said, "Don't feel guilty. I always knew you loved me. That's all that matters." Anna didn't cry when she read it. She just folded the page carefully and held it to her chest. That one page seemed to lift a weight from her shoulders that I hadn't even realized she was carrying. In the evenings, we began taking walks around the neighborhood. It's not far, just down the block and back, passing familiar houses and waving. Two neighbors who had watched the slow, quiet unraveling of Ellen's final days. Summer air was warm and fragrant, and the streets were lined with the sound of cicadas and children playing in distant yards. It was peaceful, and with each walk, I could feel something loosening inside, me the tension of goodbye beginning to dissolve into the softness of memory. Ellen's presence didn't vanish. If anything, it deepened. She was in the wind chimes that tinkled softly from the porch. She was in the way the tomatoes continued to ripen on the vines she had planted months ago. She was in the scent of the garden after a fresh watering, and in the way Anna sometimes laughed unexpectedly while reading an old note aloud. On the last night before Anna flew home, we sat outside beneath the stars again. She brought out 2 glasses of lemonade, and we watched the sky for shooting stars. Speaking not of grief, but of beginnings. She told me she hadn't realized how much her mother had softened in her final year, how different Ellen had seemed. In my stories compared to the stern figure from her childhood, you got the best version of her, she said. I shook my head and told her that I thought we both did just in different seasons. There was no jealousy in her tone, only reflection, and perhaps a bit of healing. She asked me what I planned to do next. I didn't have an answer. I hadn't thought that far. I only knew that something in me had shifted, that the life I'd walked into as a delivery man had grown far beyond the simple exchange of groceries and addresses. Something had taken root in understanding of time, of presence, of how much one life could mean to another without needing labels or long histories. That night, after Anna went inside to finish packing, I lingered a while longer on the porch. The garden lights buzzed gently, and the breeze carried the faintest scent of jasmine. I thought about Ellen's final days, about the questions she had asked me that very first night, and how staying until morning had stretched into something far more profound. I hadn't just stayed for one night. I'd stayed through seasons of a life, and in doing so, discovered my own. Weeks passed. With them came a slow but steady return to my regular routines. The grocery deliveries continued, familiar streets, and familiar doors, each one a small rhythm that now carried a different weight. I wasn't the same man who had first knocked on Ellen's door with a plastic crate of canned goods and fruit. That version of me had been drifting, going through the motions of work and life without looking too deeply at either. But now I found myself noticing more. The way an elderly man smiled when I brought him a loaf of bread he hadn't been able to find in months. The way a single mother's eyes softened when I remembered to double bag the eggs. These details mattered in a way they hadn't before, as if every interaction held the potential to mean something more. To become a thread in a tapestry I hadn't been paying attention to until Ellen taught me how. The world around me didn't change. My lens for seeing it had sharpened. I began stopping longer at doorsteps, letting conversations stretch out past the transactional. One older man invited me in to show me photos of his late wife's rose garden. Young widow shared that her son's birthday was coming up and she didn't know how to make it special. I found myself making mental notes, jotting reminders on paper, scraps this person likes cinnamon rolls. That person asks about the weather not because they care, but because they need a reason to connect. I didn't suddenly become some local hero or town favorite. I was still the delivery guy. But I became more deliberate, more human.
Nice.
I realized that staying until morning wasn't about time on a clock. It was about presence, about choosing. To stay emotionally, mentally, spiritually, wherever I was needed. I returned to Ellen's house once more before it was sold. Anna had asked me if I wanted anything from it, something small to keep. I told her I'd think about it, but the truth was, I didn't need an object to remember Ellen. Still, I walked through the rooms one last time, each space echoing with quiet remnants of who she was. The living room still smelled faintly of lavender and old paper. The garden had begun to overgrow, but it bloomed all the same, as if her hands were still coaxing life from the soil. I paused at the hallway, fingers trailing along the wall as I walked, and finally entered the bedroom. Everything had been tidied, bed stripped, nightstand cleared, but it still felt like her somehow, like the air hadn't quite adjusted to her absence. On a whim, I opened the drawer where she once kept her notebooks. Most were gone, packed or stored, but one remained. A slim, leather-bound journal I didn't remember seeing before. Inside were brief entries, dated sporadically. Spanning back several months, the handwriting was hers, steady but growing lighter near the end. The final page was short. He stayed, not just until morning, but for all the hours I needed him. And somehow, that was everything. I closed the book gently and didn't ask if Anna meant to leave it behind. I understood then that this was what I was meant to take, not the object itself, but the message, the acknowledgement, the quiet finality of it. I tucked it into my bag, not out of possession, but because some things are meant to be carried forward. Outside, the sky had shifted into a deep gold, the kind of light that only happens at the end of certain days or certain stories. I stood on the porch for a long while, watching it, breathing it in. I didn't feel grief in the traditional sense. I felt full, like I had been witness to something rare and honest. A life winding down, not in loneliness, but in connection, in dignity, in love. Not of romance, but of presence. And I had been part of it, not because I planned to be, but because I said yes when a stranger asked me to stay, as I drove away that final time. The road ahead looked the same as it always had, pavement and trees. Power lines cutting through open sky, but everything in me felt different, more awake, more anchored. I didn't know what came next or who might open the next door I'd knock on. But I knew this. I would arrive more present, more open, more willing to stay not just until morning, but for as long as I was needed. Because sometimes what begins as a simple delivery becomes the journey that delivers you back to yourself, up. Next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.